were for the most part deserted. Parents have been told by principals in most cases that even basic supervision would not be available. Meanwhile, the teachers, or 472 of them, met at the Broadmeadow Police Boys Club. That meeting listened in on a much larger Sydney meeting, but both considered and voted on the same resolution. That was that there be an ongoing campaign of political, industrial, electoral and publicity activity for the first term next year. Further talks are to be called with the Premier, and teachers in secondary state schools are to be asked for support. Newcastle teachers will raise the pertinent issues with local members of Parliament, according to the Teachers Federation's Hunter Regional Organiser, Mr Barry Johnson.
The local teachers are now going to localise the campaign, and we're going to highlight the needs in local schools in regards to maintenance, buildings falling down, the lack of new buildings which are required and so on. And we'll be publicising those with the community and with local politicians.
So specifically you want more staff, is that right?
That's one of the areas that we're asking about, and specifically in areas such as school libraries, in areas such as specialist teachers for special education, and there are 100,000 children in normal classes who need that attention who aren't getting it, and also of course in the area of face-to-face relief.
So no more strikes, but the campaign will take a different tack for the rest of the year?
No more strikes this year. The campaign will take a different tack, but of course the local teachers here have endorsed a wider campaign commencing at the beginning of next year, which will include the possibility of running candidates for the upper house in the next state elections.
'Certainly they're fully aware of all those conditions.
The City Planner's review of
stage,
restaurant parking codes went before last night's Works and Planning Committee. The committee's chairman,
Do you think
John
that the restaurant
agrees
parking
with Mr.
provision should be
Fielding's
changed?
argument.
Yes, I think they should. I think it's a recognition of the fact that restaurants, when they do open, have difficulties with meeting the parking requirements. And this is a move to see that that difficulty can be overcome in a way that's equitable to everybody concerned. And I think it will be good for the development of restaurants in the future.
Under the existing parking provisions, restaurants have to provide one parking space for every 7 square metres of table service area, compared to shops which have to provide one parking space for every 40 to 60 square metres of floor space. It's proposed that retail rates apply to restaurants. Mr. Fielding says at the moment, restaurants and food outlets, especially in the city, are being discouraged because of the substantial parking contribution. He cited one Newcastle West coffee lounge which had to pay $20,000. And according to the city planner, there are some cases where the parking contribution outweighs the viability of restaurant ventures.
3 years of drought forced this field to lie fallow. Now, with the perfect formula of consistent light showers after sowing, the same field is showing promise of a grain yield of something close to 5 tonnes to the hectare. And the situation at Wootton is typical of most of the state's wheat-growing areas. All that's needed now for a record crop is that nature plays ball, because things could still go wrong. Stripe rust has already caused some worries, and hail and wind damage could reduce yield.
We could have a hailstorm. There's been a lot of hailstorms around, and we could have high winds which could flatten the crop and could lodge, or finally we could have too much rain at harvest time around the end of November, and it could reshoot, and we'd be in strife then.
But you must be, this must be a turn for a good one.
I think this is the big one, finally.
Morning, Chairman. How are you? This occasion, I'll walk up each step. How are you? Good to see you. Good. Hello, David. We finally finished. Oh, wow.
Yes, it didn't take long.
Yeah,
yeah.
Good. Morning.
That claim, among many others, was made at a seminar in Newcastle today. The predictions have been documented in this Housing Industry Authority's Commonwealth Budget and Business Outlook, a report that examines international as well as local forces on the industry. New South Wales Chief Executive of the HIA, Mr Pat Hopkins.
We see this as the beginning of the recovery. We think the next 18 months, in fact, will provide quite a major stimulation in the economy generally. There are some reservations about the period following that 18 months, but certainly for the next 18 months we believe there'll be a considerable increase.
Specifically, what are some of the things that you see will build up the housing industry?
We believe that, firstly, I believe the Commonwealth First Home Owner Scheme from Canberra, which allows people with no children to take $5,000 to help them with their first home, up to $7,000 for people with 2 children, will make a major difference. There's a slight problem, however, in New South Wales with that, and that is that the cost of land in New South Wales is considerably more than in any other state. This being so, we're inclined to think that the Commonwealth scheme, welcome though it is, will need some help from the New South Wales government.
No one is quite sure when Clevedon Hospital in East Gresford will close, but preparations are underway to ensure that the community will not be left without a health service. A public meeting was held last week and it was reluctantly accepted that the hospital the people of Gresford had worked so hard to maintain would have to be closed down. It was then decided that a district nurse should be appointed to Gresford. Today, delegations from Maitland Hospital, which is responsible for the area, the Health Department and the Gresford Hospital Action Committee looked at possible locations of the proposed base for the community nurse. It was also proposed that emergency equipment should be placed in the office and that first aid classes should be started to make people more aware of what to do in an emergency. It's hoped that after-hour and weekend services can be provided locally.
Local retailers will have to decide whether or not they'll be opening until 4 p.m. on Saturdays and an extra night as well as Thursday each week, or any part of it. Sydney retailers have welcomed the Mackin recommendations as a way of clearing the electric air over illegal trading down there. In Newcastle, the mood is different.
In the body of his report, Mr Justice Mackin actually mentioned Newcastle and the Hunter Valley in particular. He said it appears to be the common view shown by employers and employees alike that weekend extensions of trading should not be recommended. He went on to say that it's currently the view in Newcastle and the Hunter Valley that the majority of employers are strongly opposed to any extension of trading hours. Nothing was put in submissions, he said, to suggest that the public interest requires that weekend trading should be recommended to override the considered view of the parties whose livelihood is directly dependent on the industry.
However, it's unlikely that there won't be any extension of hours here. It's quite possible that certain big retailers such as Coles and Kmart will open every hour they're allowed. They've demonstrated a tendency towards this in the past. The thing is that some large retailers will be forced to follow the lead or miss out on business. A lot of smaller people would choose to close, and the survivors will be those who can sort out their priorities. The government will be establishing a tribunal to help them do just that. As for the shoppers, well, so long as prices don't rise as a result, they don't care how long the shops stay open. The 125 employees at the abattoir have been living under the threat of receiving retrenchment notices tomorrow. However, it is possible that Walkers will hold off issuing those notices because of the interest being shown by various organisations in taking over the plant. The Executive Director of the company, Mr Keith Lawson, says he's expecting to receive offers by tomorrow. However, one group which has been holding talks with Walkers for several weeks, the Newcastle Regional Abattoir Company, is yet to complete a feasibility study with which it's hoping to attract government finance. The group has estimated it needs $1.4 million to purchase the works. Other parties which have expressed interest include a Northern Territory meat company and another group presently operating in the Lower Hunter.
Since the announcement of the closure of the Sydney Hospital's radiotherapy unit, the Mater Hospital at Waratah and the Health Department's regional office in Newcastle have been pushing for staff to be transferred to NewMed 2. The building, which will incorporate a radiotherapy section, won't be finished until 1985. Because of the delay between the closing of the Sydney unit and the opening of NewMed 2, it was feared that the staff at Sydney would be lost to other hospitals. But now it seems those fears were unfounded. At this stage, 5 staff will be transferred to Newcastle in 1985. They are a Director of Radiotherapy, his Secretary, the Chief Physicist, a second physicist and a biomedical engineer. Chief Executive of the Mater Hospital, Mr. Ralph Watson, says this is a significant step in the right direction.
This is the first occasion that we've had a transfer of money to actually set the oncology service and the radiotherapy service operating. And it shows a recognition by the Department of Health that additional funds are required for the radiotherapy service, and it will in time, we hope, lead to the allocation of further funds in the next 18 months when the service is fully operational. Five people involved, and they're all very pleased to come to Newcastle. They're transferring from Sydney Hospital radiotherapy unit, which is closing, and they're 5 highly trained people, specialists in radiotherapy, in the treatment of patients and in the care of the radiotherapy equipment.
Okay. Right, Ralph, thank you.
In his keynote address, Sir John Moore made large mention of the Hancock National Inquiry into the arbitration system. Apart from Professor Hancock, the panel conducting the inquiry includes Mr. George Polites, former Employers Federation chief, and retired Waterside Workers Federation leader Charlie Fitzgibbon. Sir John told today's gathering that any reform decided upon by that inquiry should not seek perfection. Rather, its job ought to be to coordinate the existing federal and state bodies. As far as the weekend conference at Salamander is concerned, it will hear tomorrow from such people as Mr. Peter Laver of BHP and Mr. Harry Hurrell, the National Secretary of the Federated Ironworkers Association. The Industrial Relations Society is a forum designed to encourage the exchange of ideas between the various bodies involved in employer-employee relations.
Principles following the national way.
Gunfire and bombs announced the American invasion last Tuesday morning. First the sound, then the jets flying in from the US aircraft carrier Independence. Radio Free Grenada broadcasting the news and making forlorn calls to the people.
This morning at 5:40, United States paratroopers began invading Grenada. Our armed forces are engaging them in fierce battle. All Grenadians are asked to report immediately to our respective militia bases. Our country is under attack.
The Americans appear to have had their targets identified. The key government offices on a prominent hill overlooking the capital came in for repeated attack. Jets with wings laden with bombs streaking in from the carrier, smoke rising from the army barracks at Fort Rupert, where General Austin had staged the coup which triggered the American invasion, and the former Prime Minister's office finally suffering a direct hit. In these first hours, the Americans succeeded in hitting many of the government ministries and residences and a few civilian homes besides. It seems they knew precisely what they wanted to destroy at this stage. This was Radio Free Grenada. What had seemed Paradise Island was suddenly very different. And by now, the Americans had already taken over the compound where the Cuban construction workers had been housed, but not without a fight. American troops were dragging the Cuban dead out feet first. 15 in all died here. None were found in uniform, and those that were armed had rifles. Little respect was paid to the dead, and they were dumped at the perimeter of the camp. Grenadan families watching expressionless from a hillside nearby. Some had brought their children to see these violent and bizarre events unfold below. Outside, too, the American troops were moving across the island on foot. By now, there were 6,000 on the island, on the lookout for Grenadan or Cuban resistance. This was day 3 of the invasion, but as with all armies, these men had to be fed. Crates of Army sea rations flown in from the American mainland were driven to their roadside patrols and unloaded. As for drinking water, well, it took a local to drink it first before any of the Americans would touch it.
Hey, you think it's all right?
It's okay. Look.
But once he'd somewhat nervously downed it, they were happy to follow suit. There were instances of nervousness on both sides.
Have you guys caught any of the action yet?
Yeah.
Some pretty hairy shit going on the airstrip yesterday. We lost a couple of guys.
A sudden explosion further along the road, and everyone began to move. Another soldier had been wounded in the attack. His colleagues rushing him to the ground, paramedics coming to his aid, a sharp reminder of the price of physical intervention. Some waited chewing on cigars, others got ready to evacuate him beneath a bizarre reminder of what Grenada once had been. Eventually, a helicopter was called in from the fleet at sea. And another was added to the lengthening list of those wounded either in the Lebanon or Grenada who are now arriving back in the United States.
Although the findings of these studies are still at the preliminary stage, many startling facts have come to light. The researchers are examining all types of drugs, both legal brands such as Seropax, Valium and Mogadon, and illegal narcotics and cannabis and their effects on motorists when combined with alcohol. The tests indicate that up to 20% of all motorists killed in car smashes had a presence of cannabis.
What
Mr.
makes
Morris
it
says many
more
people unwittingly mix
important
the
is
two
that there's a portion of
substances,
information
not
about tell
realising the
the
danger.
patients when they that if there's a mixture of alcohol, consumption of alcohol after there's been an intake of some of the common tranquilizer drugs such as Seropax, Valium or sleeping tablets like Mogadon, that has a disastrous impact or impairment on driver ability. It's a matter of first establishing the facts. Once we've done that and establish the effects that that drug abuse has, then to educate the public and to certainly, if we can do one thing, is to ask the medical profession that when they prescribe the sedative drugs, the antihistamine drugs, that they warn drivers, that they warn patients of the likely effects, and certainly that they warn patients that they should not take alcohol with those drugs if they're going to drive.
These days, the 1980 world champion racing driver Alan Jones wears a business suit more often than a racing suit. Today, he was handing over a new Saab, which Antonio Paul McCartney won in Charlestown Square lucky ticket competition. Although this entails some aspects of
Australian Grand Prix on the 13th of this month,
on his helmet again, which is the Australian Grand Prix on November the 13th. But a comeback in World Championship Formula 1 is another story.
The immediate future is I'm doing the Australian Grand Prix on the 13th of this month. In a car which was destined for Nelson Piquet, but now that he has to do tyre testing in France, he's unable to make it, so I'm driving his car. And I'm also driving a
935 twin-turbo Porsche that John Fitzpatrick's bringing over from America in the GT race. So that's, for me, very exciting because it's all going to be happening in the next couple of weeks. As far as overseas is concerned, I'm just waiting to see what happens, really.
You don't rule out the prospect of going back to Formula One then?
I haven't ruled it out completely, but I'd only go back if, A, I got a really competitive car with good money. One without the other, I wouldn't be interested because, you know, I've been there and done it, and I'd only go back if, as I say, if I got those two things going for it.
The longer you're away from Formula One, the harder it must become to align those two things of a good contract and a competitive car.
Oh, sure, and the longer you're away from it, the older you get as well, and you feel a little less...